On a hot afternoon in rural Kansas, John Miller, a retired veteran turned farmer, was digging a trench beside his weathered barn, with his loyal German shepherd, Rex, trotting nearby. Suddenly, his spade struck iron. Buried beneath the soil was a massive, rusty safe. Word spread quickly, and neighbors laughed, calling it nothing but useless junk. But when John pried it open, what lay inside was no ordinary scrap. It was a forgotten gramophone and a stack of dusty records, silent for nearly a century. What came next would transform mockery into awe, turning one man's stubborn labor into a legacy for generations. This is a story of perseverance, loyalty, and music that refused to be forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. The Kansas plains stretched endlessly beneath a sky so wide and unforgiving it seemed to press down on the land itself. The late summer sun glared without mercy, burning the soil into cracks and leaving the air heavy with the scent of dust and dry hay. The cicadas droned from the brittle grass, and the horizon shimmered with heat like a mirage. Out here, the world felt empty, save for the groan of weathered barns and the steady grind of men and animals trying to wring life out of stubborn earth. John Miller lived alone on one such farm, a few miles outside the nearest small town, a cluster of brick and wood buildings named Haviland, where church bells marked Sundays and gossip carried faster than the prairie winds. John was 63 years old, though the hard years of soldiering and farming had carved deeper lines into his face, making him appear older. His hair, once a thick black, had thinned to silver gray, cropped short out of habit from his military days. A scar ran from his right temple down toward his jaw, a pale reminder of a roadside explosion he had survived during his service overseas. His jaw was square, his mouth often set in a stern line, and his eyes, a faded steel blue, carried the weight of memories that refused to fade. Those who knew him described him as quiet, perhaps too quiet, but always steady, someone who did not bow easily to hardship or mockery. The only companion John trusted was Rex, his German shepherd. Rex was 5 years old, a powerful dog with a black and tan coat that gleamed under the sun, ears always pricked and tail high, exuding vigilance and pride. His amber eyes held both warmth and sharp intelligence. Rex was not merely a pet. He had been John's shadow ever since a farmer's widow from the next county gifted him the pup after her husband passed. The bond between them was forged through years of shared work, herding cattle, guarding the homestead, or simply walking the perimeter of fields together. Rex was protective, sometimes too much, baring his teeth at strangers until John's calm hand reminded him to stand down. Yet, for the old veteran, Rex's loyalty was the one constant he could count on. That particular afternoon, John rose before dawn as usual, drinking a cup of strong black coffee at his kitchen table, staring out at the dim line of sunrise that colored the horizon pink and gold. His farmhouse was plain, a weather-beaten two-story with peeling paint, built by his father after the war. It creaked when the winds howled, and its bones were tired but sturdy, much like John himself. He had decided the previous evening that he needed to dig a new trench near the barn, where the ground sloped unevenly. Heavy spring rains were predicted, and the wooden foundation of the barn, already gray and sagging, would not survive another season of pooled water pressing against it. By mid-morning, sweat already darkened his flannel shirt, the collar damp, his work-worn hands gripping the spade with the efficiency of a man who had lived a lifetime laboring. Rex padded beside him, tongue lolling, occasionally trotting to chase off a curious crow from the fence posts. John drove the spade into the earth again and again, lifting clumps of dry soil and tossing them aside. The rhythm of the work was steady, almost meditative, until the spade struck something hard with a hollow metallic thud. John paused, frowning. He leaned on the spade, listening, his senses sharpened by years of soldiering. That was no stone, no root. The sound had depth, an echo of iron hidden beneath layers of earth. Dropping to one knee, he brushed the dirt away with calloused fingers. The soil clung stubbornly, but soon a curved edge of metal appeared, flaked with rust and rough as sandpaper. Rex sniffed at it, barking once before stepping back, head tilted as though puzzled. Hour after hour John labored, the sun climbing higher, burning down upon him. Sweat stung his eyes, his breath grew harsh, yet he continued to dig, driven by the stubbornness that had carried him through battles and long winters. Gradually, the shape emerged, a massive iron box, its corners sharp, its surface corroded but solid, heavier than anything he had ever unearthed. By noon, he had uncovered most of the top and one side. His heart pounded not with fear but with awe. It was a safe, an old, monstrous safe, half swallowed by time itself. Its front bore the ghostly outline of hinges, and where a dial must once have been, there was only a crater of rust. John sat back on his heels, breathing hard, staring at the object. Rationally, he knew it was folly. A safe that old, buried in the dirt, would hold nothing of value. At least nothing useful in a land where water and crops meant survival. But something about its sheer stubbornness, its immovable silence, caught his imagination. It seemed less an object and more a challenge, as though fate itself had placed it in his path. The following day, when John drove into Haviland to purchase feed, the story had already spread. A neighbor had seen him hunched over in the dirt, scraping away at the hulking object, and by supper, the entire valley seemed to know. At the feed store, men lounging by the counter slapped their knees, grinning as he entered. "So, Miller," one broad-shouldered farmer named Virgil Callahan bellowed. Virgil was in his 50s, a man with a ruddy face and thick mustache that curled at the edges. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who owned more land than most, a man who believed the size of his ranch made him the voice of the valley. "Did you strike gold bars in that iron coffin of yours, or just a nest of mice?" The store erupted in laughter. Another man, lean and wiry, with tobacco stains on his teeth, chimed in. "Maybe it's full of letters from old sweethearts, eh, John? You planning to romance the dead?" Again the laughter came, sharp and mocking. John said nothing. He paid for his feed, lifted the heavy sacks into his truck with the ease of habit, and walked out. His steel-blue eyes did not flinch, but inside, the sting was there. He had been mocked before, in the army when he insisted on routines that others found tedious, and later in town when he chose to live quietly rather than remarry after his wife's passing. Yet each time, he had endured. Still, hearing the laughter now, seeing the dismissive smirks, pricked something deeper. Back on his farm, Rex greeted him with a wagging tail, sensing the tension but unable to name it. John placed a hand on the dog's strong neck, feeling the steady warmth. "Let them laugh," he muttered under his breath. "They've always laughed." That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the prairie in crimson light, John stood before the safe again. Its iron sides glowed faintly red in the dusk, as though alive. His hands rested on the rough surface, and he felt a strange conviction settle over him. This was not junk. This was not a joke. Whatever secrets it held, he would uncover them. No matter the ridicule, no matter the long nights ahead, he would not abandon it. The fields stretched silent around him, the barn groaning in the evening breeze. Somewhere far away, a coyote howled, and Rex lifted his head, ears twitching. John's gaze lingered on the hulking iron box. It had been waiting, buried in silence for decades, and now it had chosen him. The Kansas sun had a way of making the hours drag, its relentless light baking the land into hard clay, its heat drawing sweat from every pore. John Miller felt it as he stood before the hulking safe beside his leaning barn, spade still resting against the wall. The discovery had become the talk of the valley, and his name was on every tongue, though rarely in kindness. Still, he returned each evening, lantern in hand, sleeves rolled up, Rex lying faithfully at his side, to scrape at the stubborn rust that clung to the iron like armor. The days turned into weeks. Each night John worked at the safe, hunched and grim, his steel blue eyes fixed on the task as if it were an enemy to be outlasted. The wire brush screeched against corroded steel, flakes falling like orange snow, his calloused hands blistering and then hardening further. Rex lay nearby, paws crossed, amber eyes alert, growling whenever a wagon slowed on the road or a voice called mockingly from beyond the fence. Sometimes children shouted rhymes, their laughter carried by the wind, and Rex's low growl would rumble deep in his chest until John murmured, "Easy, boy." Let them laugh. One such evening, as the sun dipped low, a woman approached the fence. Rebecca Moore was in her mid-30s, a tall, slender woman with chestnut hair braided neatly down her back, her skin tanned from years of working outdoors on her family's homestead. Her hazel eyes, sharp but not unkind, watched John as he scraped at the iron box. She was known in the valley for her frankness and her independence, qualities sharpened after her husband died in a barn accident 3 years prior, leaving her to raise 2 younger brothers and tend to her family's modest farm. She rested her hands on the fence rail, her posture upright, her voice carrying easily. "You'll wear yourself to the bone, Mr. Miller," she said, not unkindly. "That thing looks like it'll fight you longer than you've got strength to spare." John glanced at her but said nothing, only wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. Rebecca studied him a moment longer before adding, "Folks may laugh, but I know stubbornness when I see it. Sometimes it's a curse, sometimes a blessing. Guess we'll see which it is for you." She gave a faint nod and walked on, her steps purposeful, her figure fading into the twilight. Rex watched her leave, tail flicking once before settling back down beside John. Not everyone who came by had words as tempered as Rebecca's. Virgil Callahan made a point of riding past whenever he could. Broad-shouldered and red-faced, his thick mustache bristling like a badge of arrogance, Virgil sat tall in his saddle, the reins loose in his large hands. He was a man who prided himself on control, over land, cattle, and the people who owed him favors. Years earlier, a severe drought had nearly ruined him, but a clever deal with a grain company, one that left smaller farmers indebted, restored his wealth. That event hardened him, making him both cautious and calculating, quick to sneer at those who failed to seize opportunity. "You'll be the county's fool before you're done, Miller," Virgil called one evening, his booming voice carrying over the field. "Better to sell me your land before you waste away on that rusted coffin. At least I'd put it to good use." He spat into the dirt and rode on, leaving dust and contempt in his wake. John's jaw tightened, his scar pulling slightly as his expression hardened. He did not answer, but the muscles in his arm worked faster, the rasp of the brush against the safe loud in the quiet dusk. Rex's ears flattened, a growl rising, but John's firm hand stilled him. "Not worth it, boy," he muttered. In town, the gossip grew sharper. At the general store, Samuel Wright, a wiry man with thinning hair and spectacles perched on a long nose, made sport of John's efforts. Samuel had once been John's comrade during service in the National Guard, But after leaving the army, he became known as a man who preferred comfort to hardship, his wit often used as a shield against the insecurities that gnawed at him. "He'll scrape himself into the grave," Samuel said loudly to the amusement of others. "Mark my words, that safe will open to nothing but dust. Miller's chasing ghosts while the rest of us tend to living work." The laughter rang out, filling the store. But John only adjusted his hat and carried his supplies out, ignoring their eyes on his back. He remembered the nights under foreign skies, when Samuel had once trembled at the sound of mortar fire, relying on John's steadiness to keep him grounded. How easily people forgot. Through it all, John pressed on. The safe became his ritual, his discipline. Each evening he lit the lantern, the glow casting long shadows across the barnyard as the prairie wind rattled the boards of the barn. The scrape of brush, the clang of hammer, the hiss of file. These became the rhythm of his nights. His arms ached, his back stiffened, but he did not yield. To him, it was no longer just an object. It was a test, a measure of whether persistence could outlast ridicule. Rex shared in this devotion. Sometimes he lay with his muzzle resting on his paws, eyes fixed on his master, as though guarding not just the man, but the very act of faith that kept John at work. Other times he patrolled the fence line, barking at coyotes or strangers who slowed too long. His presence was a comfort, a reminder that loyalty still existed in a world eager to dismiss. Weeks passed, and slowly the safe began to reveal its seams beneath the rust. The corroded surface gave way in patches to glimpses of dark steel, solid and unyielding. Each flake that fell seemed to whisper encouragement, as if the safe itself responded to John's persistence. Neighbors continued to laugh. Wagons slowed to gawk, but Rebecca Moore's words lingered in his mind. Sometimes it's a curse, sometimes a blessing, he intended to prove which. One evening, as the cicadas sang and the sky burned orange, John stepped back, wiping grime from his brow. Rex stood beside him, panting softly. The safe, though still locked tight, looked less like a relic and more like a puzzle waiting for its solution. The ridicule of others seemed far away. All that mattered now was the quiet certainty that he wasn't wasting his nights. He was carving through time itself, peeling back the years to uncover whatever truth lay buried within. John placed his hand firmly on the iron surface, the metal warm from the day's heat, but cool beneath the rust. He whispered more to himself than to Rex. "We'll see it through, old boy. We'll see it through." The German shepherd wagged his tail once, amber eyes gleaming in the lantern light, as though agreeing with every word. And so, in defiance of laughter and doubt, the work continued. The weeks of scraping, chiseling, and brushing had ground John's patience thin, but his determination had only hardened. Each evening, after the sun bled into the horizon and the prairie winds cooled, he lit his lantern and returned to the hulking safe. Rex kept vigil beside him, sometimes watching his master intently, sometimes prowling the fence line as if guarding not just the land, but the secret that had consumed John's nights. The laughter of neighbors had not faded, but John no longer let it pierce him. Every screech of metal against rust, every flake of corrosion that fell to the dirt, was one step closer to truth. It was on a damp evening, after a sudden summer storm left the fields smelling of wet earth, that the first sign of victory came. John's wedge, hammered relentlessly at the seam of the safe, finally shifted something deep within. The groan of corroded hinges filled the air, so loud Rex barked sharply, circling with excitement. John's chest tightened as he forced the wedge again. With one last strike, the door gave a shuddering protest before creaking open, rust falling like brittle snowflakes. The lantern's glow spilled into the dark maw of the safe, illuminating not the emptiness he had half expected, but something wholly different. Inside lay a gramophone. Its brass horn, once golden, was dulled to a dark brown, spotted with greenish tarnish. The crank on its side was frozen stiff, the wooden body cracked and warped from years of dampness, and the needle arm hung uselessly at an angle. Yet despite its wounds, the machine carried a strange dignity, as though it had waited decades to be rediscovered. Next to it sat a narrow wooden box, edges worn but intact, and when John pulled it forward, dust rose thickly. The lid opened with a creak, revealing a neat stack of records, black discs still whole though their sleeves were yellowed and brittle. He wiped one gently with his handkerchief, revealing grooves etched in spirals, waiting for sound. John's breath caught. To others, this might be trash, but he knew what he held. Voices and songs from another age, preserved by chance beneath his barn. Rex whined softly, nudging John's arm with his nose as if sensing the weight of the discovery. The next morning, word spread as it always did. By the time John walked into town for supplies, the news had already circled. At the general store, Virgil Callahan stood at the counter, booming with laughter as he slapped the back of a younger man. "So the old fool's safe had a toy inside. A broken music box for his trouble." Virgil roared, his mustache twitching as he grinned. His large frame, wrapped in a dust-stained vest, blocked half the aisle as he spoke. "Tell me, John, you going to play soldier with that thing? Maybe march Rex to its tune?" The store erupted with laughter again. John said nothing. He hefted his sack of flour onto the counter, his jaw firm, his steel blue eyes steady. Behind Virgil stood a new face. David Harper, a young man in his 20s recently hired at the blacksmith's. He was tall and lanky, his sandy hair perpetually tousled, his pale skin freckled by the sun. His gray eyes held curiosity rather than mockery, and he asked quietly, "What kind of machine was it, Mr. Miller?" "A gramophone," John answered simply. David tilted his head, intrigued. He had always been fascinated by machines, though he rarely admitted it in front of men like Virgil, who considered such interests frivolous. "Never seen one up close," David muttered, almost to himself. "They say music like that could carry a whole room." Virgil snorted, dismissing him with a wave. "Bah! Nothing but rattles and squeaks." Yet David's eyes lingered on John, a spark of interest there, before he lowered his gaze and returned to stacking nails. Back at the farm, John cleared a space on his kitchen table. He placed the gramophone carefully, its weight solid despite its scars. Rex sat nearby, ears perked, watching every movement. John tested the crank, but it refused to budge. The gears inside were stiff, cemented with years of neglect. The needle arm wobbled loosely, its tip broken clean off. Yet the machine was not dead. John felt it like a heartbeat waiting to be restored. He inspected the records next. Some had chips at the edges, but most were intact, their grooves sharp even under the dust. He lifted one close to the lamp, reading faint words etched on the faded label. Duke Ellington Orchestra. His lips curved faintly. Jazz, the music of smoke-filled halls and lively nights long before his time in uniform, before hardship made silence his only company. That night, as John oiled the gears and examined each piece, Rebecca Moore stopped by again. Her chestnut braid was damp from the earlier rain, her hazel eyes bright against the lantern light. She leaned casually against the fence, arms folded, her posture both relaxed and strong. "You really mean to fix it?" she asked. "Folks say it's nothing but scrap." "Folks say many things," John replied evenly, tightening a bolt. Rebecca tilted her head, studying him. You were always the quiet one, John. Never cared much for chatter, never bowed to laughter. That's what made you a good soldier, they say. Maybe that's what'll make you finish this." Her words carried neither jest nor pity, only observation. With a nod, she left, her silhouette vanishing into the night. John paused, staring at the gramophone. He ran a hand over its tarnished horn, feeling the dents, the roughness, the weight of history. He thought of his wife, gone years now, who had loved to hum along to records on their old radio before the static swallowed the sound. He thought of nights in foreign deserts, when music from a cheap cassette player in camp had been the only thing that kept despair at bay. Music had always mattered, even when others dismissed it. And now, here it was, waiting again. Rex shifted, laying his head on John's boot, sighing heavily as if reminding him he was not alone. By midnight, John sat back, hands black with oil, eyes weary but alive. The gramophone was not yet ready, but he knew one thing with certainty. It would sing again. Not for the laughter of others, but for the truth it carried, a truth that time and rust had not managed to bury. The nights in Kansas grew cooler as autumn crept into the valley, but John Miller's determination burned steady. In the dim light of his farmhouse kitchen, the gramophone sat on the table like a wounded veteran, scarred, battered, but not yet silenced. John leaned close with a magnifying glass, his hands steady despite the weariness of age, eyes narrowed in focus. The stack of dusty records waited nearby, each one promising voices from the past if only the machine could be coaxed back to life. Rex, ever faithful, lay on the rug at John's feet, his strong frame curled protectively near the chair. His ears twitched at the sound of every tool, screwdriver turning, cloth rubbing brass, the faint creak of wood. Occasionally he lifted his head and sniffed, curious at the strange sense of polish and oil. When the hours dragged too long, Rex would place his nose against John's knee, reminding him to pause, but John only gave a rough pat before continuing. The work was slow. John began with the horn, a tarnished brass trumpet dulled to brown and green. He polished it for hours, rubbing away decades of neglect until patches of soft golden shine began to emerge. The task was tedious, yet as the horn brightened, so too did John's spirits. He had spent years in the military learning the value of small victories, of polishing boots until they gleamed even in the mud of war. This was no different. It was discipline, persistence, the soldier's way carried into a farmer's life. The gears inside were worse. Rust had fused some parts together, and the crank refused to budge. John disassembled the side panel carefully, laying each piece on a cloth. He cleaned every cog with wire wool, dipped them in oil, and worked them gently until they turned once more. Sparks of satisfaction lit his eyes whenever a frozen wheel spun freely again. But setbacks were constant. The first needle he tried snapped in his fingers, brittle from age. The wooden case splintered when he pressed too hard with a file. More than once he cursed under his breath, the old scar along his jaw tightening as frustration flared. Yet each failure only drew him back with more stubbornness. Neighbors passing by did not let him forget their scorn. Wagons slowed at dusk, and voices called out across the fields. "Sing us a song, Miller," someone jeered. Another shouted, "Maybe that mutt of yours can howl along when the box croaks." Laughter followed, sharp and mocking. Rex barked fiercely at them, teeth flashing white in the lantern glow, but John only stroked the dog's head, muttering, "Let them go." "We've weathered worse," one afternoon, as John examined the records under sunlight for cracks. David Harper approached. The young blacksmith's helper had walked the dirt road with his long strides, his lanky figure outlined against the pale sky. His gray eyes shone with the same curiosity that had marked him in town. He leaned over the fence, awkward but earnest. "Mr. Miller," he began, voice cautious. "If you need a new needle, I might be able to fashion one at the forge. Steel, tempered fine, better than what you've got." John studied the young man. David's sandy hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat, his freckled skin flushed from the walk. There was sincerity in his expression, though a shadow of hesitation, too, as if worried John would laugh at him the way others did. "That would help," John admitted, his voice low and measured. "Bring it by when you can." David nodded quickly, relief softening his features. "I will. My father thinks I waste time tinkering with gadgets, but machines make sense to me. They don't lie, they just need patience." His lips curved in a faint smile before he turned back toward town, long strides kicking up dust. That night, John received the new needle. Slim, gleaming, it fit perfectly into the arm once bent and useless. He tested the movement, feeling the precision in its weight. For the first time, the machine looked less like wreckage and more like possibility. Rebecca Moore also visited again, bringing with her a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She stood tall at the porch, her chestnut braid falling loosely over one shoulder, hazel eyes calm as she offered the gift. Inside were old rags of soft linen, good for polishing. "Thought you could use these," she said simply. "My brother said I'm wasting my time even noticing, but sometimes a stubborn man is worth watching." Her tone carried a wry humor, but also a trace of admiration. John accepted with a nod, not trusting himself with many words. He was not a man who sought company, but her presence left a quiet warmth in the room long after she departed. Rex sniffed at the cloths, tail wagging slightly, as though approving. The days became a cycle of work. Each record was cleaned, the fine grooves brushed free of dust. The wooden body of the gramophone was sanded gently, its cracks filled with glue, its surface rubbed with oil until it regained a faint glow. Piece by piece, the machine came alive again, though it was still fragile, still incomplete. John often caught himself imagining the music it might hold. He remembered sitting in crowded tents overseas, where a single song on a battered radio had lifted weary soldiers out of despair. He remembered his wife humming while kneading bread, her voice blending with the crackling radio in their kitchen. Music had carried him through battles, loss, and loneliness. To hear it again, pulled from these silent records, would be more than victory. It would be resurrection. One late evening, as stars wheeled silently above, John set the gramophone back together. Rex sat close, eyes fixed on the machine, as though understanding the importance of the moment. The crank turned now, smooth and sure. The horn gleamed faintly golden in the lantern's glow. The new needle rested in place, ready. But John did not yet play the record. Not tonight. It was not ready, not perfect. Instead, he sat back, arms folded, heart steady with the knowledge that he was closer than ever. The jeers of neighbors no longer mattered. This was his mission, his battle, and he would see it through. The evening was quiet. The kind of quiet that settled deep into the Kansas prairie after the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was cool, carrying the scent of cut hay and dry earth. Inside his farmhouse kitchen, John Miller stood before the gramophone he had spent months repairing. The brass horn, once dull and brown, now gleamed softly in the lamplight, polished to a muted gold. The gears turned smoothly, the crank steady, the new needle glinting faintly as if eager to be tested. The stack of cleaned records lay beside it, black discs shining faintly after hours of careful wiping. Tonight would be the night. Rex sensed the change. The German shepherd, 5 years old and strong, shifted from his place by the stove, amber eyes fixed on his master with anticipation. His ears twitched forward, tail wagging slowly. He seemed to understand something important was about to happen. John placed a hand on the dog's head, feeling the warmth and strength beneath the fur. "You've waited with me all this time, boy. Let's hear what we've been working for." With careful hands, John selected a record from the stack. The label was faded but legible. Duke Ellington Orchestra. He placed it gently on the turntable, adjusted the crank, and listened to the soft whir as the gears engaged. Then, with a breath held tight in his chest, he lowered the needle onto the spinning disc. At first, there was only a scratchy hiss, the sound of time itself whispering through the grooves. Then, slowly, a melody emerged. Brass instruments swelled, warm and rich, carrying a jazz rhythm that filled the kitchen with life. The horns blared with confidence, the piano skipped with playful energy, and the faint crackle of the record only added to the authenticity, like a voice returning from a long silence. John closed his eyes. Memories surged. Nights long ago when his wife hummed softly to the radio as she prepared supper, her hands dusted with flour. Days in the army when a single battered cassette player lifted the spirits of weary men in tents half a world away. The music was not just sound, it was time itself, resurrected. Tears slipped down his weathered cheeks, glistening in the lamplight. Rex barked once, startled by the sudden burst of sound, then tilted his head, ears perked, tail swishing with uncertain excitement. He padded closer, sniffing the horn, as though trying to understand how such voices came from the golden trumpet. When a trumpet solo soared, Rex let out a small whine, then settled beside John's chair, listening with quiet fascination. The song ended, fading back into the soft hiss of the needle against the groove. John lifted the arm gently, his hands trembling, his heart pounding as though he had just fought a battle. He sat in silence for a long while, the weight of loneliness lifted by a single melody. He whispered, more to himself than to Rex. She would have loved this. The following morning, John could not contain the quiet pride in his step. He cranked the gramophone again, letting the music spill into the open windows as he went about chores. The sound carried faintly across the fields, drifting on the prairie wind. It was not long before someone heard. A young girl named Clara Jenkins, no more than 12, stopped at the fence on her way to town. Clara was small and slender, with dark braids tied neatly with ribbon and a freckled nose. Her family owned a modest dairy farm nearby, and she was known for her curiosity, often peppering adults with questions they found both amusing and tiresome. She leaned against the fence, eyes wide, listening. "Mr. Miller," she called shyly, "is that a band playing?" John wiped his hands on his jeans, standing tall. His silver-gray hair caught the light, his steel-blue eyes calm. "Not a band, Clara. A machine, a gramophone." Her mouth dropped open in awe. "It sounds like magic." He smiled faintly, nodding toward Rex, who barked once in agreement. "Maybe it is." By afternoon, word spread again. This time, when Virgil Callahan rode past, he slowed, his ruddy face creased not in laughter but in suspicion. His thick mustache twitched as he listened to the faint strains of jazz drifting from John's windows. "So the damn thing makes noise," he muttered. "Let's see how long it lasts." Yet he did not laugh as before. Rebecca Moore also returned that evening. She stood at the doorway, tall and steady, chestnut braid falling over her shoulder, her hazel eyes softer than before. I heard music, she said simply. Clear as a bell, all the way across my field. John gestured toward the table. It works. After all these years, it works. Rebecca stepped inside, cautious at first, then closer to the machine. She ran her fingers lightly along the polished wood, her gaze filled with wonder. It's beautiful, she murmured. Then, after a pause, she looked at John. You've done something no one else would have had the patience for. John said nothing, but in his heart, her words carried more weight than the scorn of a dozen Virgil Callahans. That night, as another record spun and music filled the small kitchen, John sat with Rex at his feet, Rebecca listening quietly nearby. The world outside might still scoff, but inside that farmhouse, time itself seemed to bend, bringing past and present together in harmony. By the time October winds swept across the Kansas plains, the story of John Miller's gramophone had spread far beyond the valley. What began as a curiosity whispered over fence lines and laughed about in the feed store had become a tale told in town squares, carried by wagons, and eventually printed in the small county newspaper. People came not to mock, but to marvel, and John found himself standing at the center of an attention he had never sought. It began with a man named Harold Green, a local reporter for the Haviland Chronicle. Harold was in his late 40s, short and stout, with thinning blonde hair combed meticulously to one side, a sharp nose, and spectacles that constantly slid down his face. His ink-stained fingers and notepad were as much a part of him as his skeptical nature. Known for being relentless in his pursuit of stories, Harold had built a reputation for exposing small-town scandals, councilmen skimming money, ranchers falsifying weights at the market. He was not cruel, but he had a way of asking questions that made people sweat. When he arrived at John's farm one chilly morning, Harold carried himself with the brisk determination of a man convinced he was about to uncover either a fraud or a miracle. Mr. Miller, Harold began, standing at the porch with his notepad ready. Folks say you dug up a gramophone and made it sing again. That true? Or is this valley just desperate for entertainment? John, leaning against the doorframe, steel-blue eyes steady, gave no flourish to his answer. It's true. You're welcome to hear it for yourself inside. Harold watched intently as John placed a record on the turntable, Rex sitting nearby, tail wagging slowly, as though recognizing the importance of the moment. When the first notes of jazz spilled from the brass horn, Harold's skeptical frown softened into something like awe. His pen stilled for once. Well, I'll be damned, he murmured. The article appeared 2 days later, titled, War Veteran Revives Voice of the Past. It described John's persistence, the ridicule he endured, and the moment the gramophone sang again. By the week's end, strangers began arriving at his farm. Farmers from neighboring counties, schoolteachers with curious children, and eventually men and women from the city. Among them was Dr. Leonard Strauss, a music historian from Wichita. Dr. Strauss was in his early 60s, tall and thin with a shock of white hair, neatly trimmed beard, and piercing green eyes that seemed to measure every detail. He wore a well-pressed tweed suit, even in the dusty Kansas fields, and carried himself with the air of a man who had spent a lifetime lecturing in lecture halls. He was known for his passionate lectures on early American music and his disdain for anything less than authentic preservation. When John played the gramophone for him, Dr. Strauss leaned close, listening not only to the melody but to the crackle and hiss of the old record. His long fingers tapped along with the rhythm, his expression grave but reverent. This, he said finally, adjusting his spectacles, is not merely a gramophone. This is an artifact of immense cultural value. And these records, these are treasures. Many collections were lost in fires, wars, or neglect. To find them intact, here, in this safe, It is nothing short of remarkable." His words spread faster than Harold Greene's article ever could. Soon, more visitors arrived. Scholars, collectors, even musicians eager to hear the authentic sound of a bygone era. A photographer from Wichita snapped pictures of John standing stoically beside the gramophone, Rex seated proudly at his feet, his black and tan coat gleaming. The photo ran in the state paper, and suddenly John was no longer a local curiosity. He was the man who had pulled music out of the ground. Rebecca Moore noticed the change, too. She stood beside her brothers one Sunday at church, listening as neighbors spoke in hushed, almost reverent tones about John. Where once they had laughed, now they praised. Her hazel eyes softened as she glanced across the pews at the quiet man sitting with his hat in his lap, Rex resting obediently by the door. For the first time in years, John was not the butt of whispers, but the subject of admiration. Even Clara Jenkins, the curious girl with the braids, now boasted to her classmates that she had been the first to hear the music drift across the fields. "It sounded like magic," she said proudly, and her words spread like wildfire among the children, who began daring one another to sneak close enough to John's farmhouse to catch a note or two. Of course, not everyone was pleased. Virgil Callahan watched all of this unfold with thinly veiled resentment. The wealthy rancher, once so eager to mock, now found his voice drowned out by admiration for John. He rode past less often, his ruddy face tight, his mustache bristling as he saw wagons gathered near John's place. Virgil's pride, shaped by years of believing his land and wealth made him the center of the valley, could not tolerate another man, especially quiet, stubborn John Miller, becoming the one everyone spoke of. But John paid Virgil no mind. Each evening, as autumn deepened and the first hints of frost touched the fields, he cranked the gramophone and listened as the music filled his kitchen. Rex would lie close, ears flicking, amber eyes content. Sometimes Rebecca joined, her tall figure framed by the doorway, her chestnut hair catching the lamplight as she listened quietly. Other times David Harper stopped by, bringing small adjustments for the machine from the forge, his lanky frame leaning awkwardly against the wall as he watched, gray eyes wide with wonder. The laughter that once haunted John had faded, replaced now with respect, curiosity, even gratitude. The gramophone had shifted from being a rusted relic to becoming the pride of the valley. And though John never sought glory, he felt something stir within him each time the music played. For once, he was not simply surviving the days. He was giving life back to something the world had almost forgotten. Winter had come early to the Kansas Valley, dusting the fields with frost that sparkled beneath the pale morning sun. The trees stood bare, their branches etched like black ink against the sky, and the air carried a sharpness that made every breath visible. At John Miller's farmhouse, however, warmth lingered, not only from the fire crackling in the hearth, but from the music that continued to rise each evening from the old gramophone. The story had grown far beyond Haviland. What Harold Greene had first printed in the Chronicle was now echoed in larger papers, and Dr. Leonard Strauss's report had traveled across universities and museums. The farmhouse, once a lonely outpost of ridicule, had become a symbol of stubborn faith rewarded. The state's cultural board soon took notice, sending representatives to evaluate the find. Among them was Eleanor Whitfield, a curator from the Kansas State Museum. Eleanor was in her early 40s, tall and slender, with dark auburn hair pulled into a bun, her skin pale from years working indoors among archives. She carried herself with quiet authority, her gray eyes keen behind wire-rimmed glasses. Unlike reporters hungry for sensation, Eleanor approached John with a gentleness that spoke of reverence for history. She inspected the gramophone with gloved hands, her voice measured. "Mr. Miller, What you've preserved here is not just an object. It is memory. And memory belongs to all who seek to understand where we came from. John, sitting at the table with Rex by his feet, nodded slowly. His steel-blue eyes held no pride, only calm acceptance. I only kept at it because it didn't feel right to abandon it. Seemed like it was waiting for someone to listen again. Within weeks, the decision was made. The gramophone and the original stack of records would be formally declared a state-recognized cultural artifact to be preserved and displayed in the Kansas State Museum. A ceremony was arranged, simple but solemn, in which John was invited as the honored guest. The event took place in the town hall of Haviland. The building, a red brick structure with high-arched windows, had seen countless community meetings, church gatherings, and dances. On this day, it was filled with townsfolk who once laughed at John, but now came in pressed shirts and dresses, eager to witness history. Banners hung from the rafters, and a polished table at the front bore the gramophone, gleaming beneath the lights, its brass horn glowing as though proud of its resurrection. Rebecca Moore stood near the aisle, her tall figure wrapped in a woolen coat, chestnut hair braided neatly, her hazel eyes steady as they followed John walking slowly to the front. Beside him padded Rex, his black and tan coat sleek, his ears alert, earning delighted smiles from children who whispered in awe about the loyal dog. Clara Jenkins was among them, her braids tied with new ribbons, her freckled face glowing with pride as she whispered, "That's the machine I heard first." The mayor of Haviland, a stout man named Robert Daly, with a booming voice and a thick mustache streaked with gray, presented John with a certificate. Robert had long been known as a practical man, more concerned with taxes and cattle numbers than with culture. But even he spoke with genuine warmth. "Mr. Miller, your perseverance has brought honor not only to yourself, but to this town and this valley. What was once a cause for laughter has become a legacy we will all remember." Applause filled the hall, echoing off the brick walls. John stood quietly, his scarred jaw tight, his eyes lowered. He was not a man for speeches, but when the mayor gestured for him to speak, he cleared his throat and said simply, "I didn't do it for pride. I did it because some things shouldn't be forgotten, and because when the world laughed, I knew in my bones there was still something worth saving." His words, plain and unpolished, drew more applause than any grand speech could have. In the weeks that followed, the gramophone and its original records were moved carefully to the Kansas State Museum in Topeka, where they would be displayed with proper preservation. Yet John was not left with silence. Eleanor Whitfield had arranged for a craftsman to create a replica record from one of the originals, a gift for John to keep. When she handed it to him, her pale face softened with a rare smile. "Every man deserves to keep a piece of the past he uncovered." That evening, back on his farm, John placed the replica record on the gramophone. Rex lay close, eyes half closed, ears twitching as the familiar jazz melody filled the wooden house. John sat on the porch afterward, the record still echoing in his mind, watching the stars wheel across the frozen sky. The dog leaned against his leg, warm and solid. Music had returned not only to the valley, but to his own life. What once had been rust and ridicule was now heritage and pride. And as John listened, he realized that value is not always in what others see, but in what patience and faith can bring back to life. Sometimes, what the world throws aside as rust and ruin, God sees as seeds of wonder waiting to bloom again. John's stubborn faith in an old safe was more than chance. It was a reminder that in the quiet corners of our lives, miracles can take root. Just as the gramophone's music rose from silence, so too can hope rise from despair if we trust in God's timing. In our daily lives, we often pass by small things, an old habit, a forgotten talent, a person overlooked, thinking they have no value. But the Lord teaches us that nothing is wasted, and what seems broken can be restored to life with patience, love, and faith. So let John's story be a call to all of us. Never give up on what others dismiss, because God may be working a hidden miracle in it. Before you go, share this story with someone who needs encouragement today. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, and subscribe so you won't miss the next journey of faith and resilience. May God bless you, and may His hand guide your own hidden treasures back to light.